Right, well, I'd like to present a model I've been developing over a number of years for the faculty of intuition. Now, first of all, what is intuition? It's often defined as the ability to understand something instinctively without the need for conscious reasoning. Many psychologists understand intuition as referring to information we already possess and which lies below the threshold for awareness. But these descriptions don't say how the understanding is achieved, nor do they allow for the fact that intuition often seems to involve some sort of contact with the future. So perhaps ESP can give the answer. First, I will recapitulate my model for ESP, which regards precognition as the fundamental phenomenon. Evidence for precognition comes from the Honneth and Ferrari meta-analysis of forced-choice experiments in which a small but reliable effect was found. The targets in these experiments were randomly selected after participants had made their guesses. So the meta-analysis gives outstanding evidence for a contact with something in the future. In parapsychology, we tend to assume that the contact is made directly with the target, but such an interpretation would seem difficult, if not impossible, to explain according to currently understood principles in physics. For example, how can the information be collected and encoded in a form which is intelligible to the brain? And how can the brain obtain selectivity between the target and the decoys? But if the participant is given feedback of target information in the future, the participant's brain will possess the information in a suitably encoded form. So all we need for precognition is for a link to be set up between the brain in the future and the brain in the present. In fact, the meta-analysis includes a subset of experiments for which information was provided about the feedback given to participants. The results show that when no feedback was given, the significance of the results fell to chance expectation. Feedback, therefore, seems to be necessary for a precognitive link to be established. And it suggests that precognition is literally precognition, referring to the future cognition of an event. So now we'll look at the physics and cognitive neuroscience of precognition. We need to know how the information is transferred backwards in time and how the brain detects the transferred information. The occurrence of precognition supposes that the future events already exist in some sense. But this idea conforms to a block universe model in which past and future events coexist in the space-time continuum in accordance with the special theory of relativity. The concept of a block universe is widely accepted in physics. For example, Paul Davies commented in Scientific American that physicists prefer to think of time as set out in its entirety, laid out in its entirety, a timescape somewhat analogous to a landscape, with all the past and future events located there together. I'd like to show a simple model of the universe in 3 dimensions, using 2 coordinates of space and 1 of time. All the past and future events are laid out in the block, and the moment of the present is represented by the plane PQRS, which is an infinitesimally thin slice of space-time. The plane travels through the block in the direction of the arrows, and it has in front the events in the future, and it leaves behind the events in the past. In order to explain a transfer of information, we therefore need a deterministic model of version of quantum mechanics. One such version is David Bohm's theory of the implicate order. The implicate order is based on the zero-point energy field that extends throughout space and time. For example, throughout the volume of the block illustrated. the implicate order unfolds to produce the successive slices of space-time which build up to create the contents of the block, the slices being represented by the plane PQRS. Bohm proposed that similar structures created at different locations in space-time resonate within the implicate order, and they unfold in such a way that they become more similar to one another. The resonances are attributed to non-local effects of the Broglie-Bohm pilot waves on the quantum mechanical processes involved. We can illustrate a pair of similar structures in a two-dimensional diagram, with one structure in the future and the other in the present. Each is unfolded from the implicate order in a form in which it has already been affected by the resonance. Thus, as explained in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, if one looks back from the future, you're not changing the past to become different from what it was. Instead, you're influencing the past so that it becomes what it is. And because the structures have been influenced from outside space-time, you can have an interchange of information between them without having to transmit a signal within space-time. So how does the brain detect the information transferred? Structures in the environment are represented by processes in the brain in which neural networks are associated with one another to form spatio-temporal patterns of activation. Let's suppose that a percipient, Carol, experiences an event tomorrow. For example, she sees a snake. Networks representing the snake are associated with networks representing her previous experiences with snakes. And because the knowledge of the snake is significant for her personal well-being, an appraisal is carried out in the amygdala, which leads to the creation of an emotion. Re-entrant stimuli from the amygdala go back to the networks, and they increase the activation of the pathways through the networks. Apart from consolidating memories, this leads to a strong resonating field which influences any similar pathway activated elsewhere in space and time. So for Carol to precognize the experience today, she spontaneously activates various pathways through the networks until one of them happens to be similar to the pathway activated at the time of tomorrow's experience. The resulting patterns resonate, and the synaptic connections forming today's pattern are slightly strengthened. This facilitates the flow of extra impulses, and it increases the degree of activation of the pattern. If the threshold for consciousness is reached, Carol becomes aware of an event that is similar to the event she will experience tomorrow. So what about the best conditions for precognition? First, when the future experience has a strong emotional impact. That's because the pathway corresponding to an emotional experience is reactivated to a greater extent, producing a stronger resonance. And second, when the temporal distance or precognitive interval to the time of the future experience is short. That's because the synaptic connections forming the pathway change constantly due to neuroplasticity, so there's a closer matching and stronger resonance are to be expected when the precognitive interval is short. Precognitive dreams, for example, often refer to events the following day, but it is rare that the events occur several weeks in the future. The mechanism suggests that ESP is simplified considerably. Precognition is a link with one's brain in the future, and telepathy is a link with the brain of another person. However, telepathic links are expected to be very much weaker for the simple reason that the brains are different. And according to this model, clairvoyant contacts do not occur because of the dissimilarity between the brain and an inanimate object. Clairvoyance, and most cases of telepathy, are explained as precognition of the percipient's future knowledge of the event. So now let's look at intuition. Which could almost be regarded as the opposite of precognition. Intuition occurs when a participant has an intention in the present to do something in the future. For example, a percipient, Tom, intends to take the train to Paris. He activates networks in his brain through which he associates the idea taking the train with the idea arriving in Paris. In the future, he fulfills the intention, and this experience is that of taking the train and arriving in Paris. The present and future patterns are similar, and they resonate. This enables Tom to precognize the knowledge that he will be successfully able to fulfill his intention. Suppose now that Tom again intends to take the train, but on this occasion, the train is destined to crash. If he does take the train, his future experience will not be that of arriving in Paris. It will be that of experiencing the crash. His intention will not be fulfilled. The patterns are different, and resonance is not produced. The absence of resonance, in this case, serves as an intuitive warning, indicating that something will prevent Tom from fulfilling his intention. The warning doesn't say specifically that it will be due to an accident, but it might give him the feeling that something is wrong. Tom unconsciously changes his intention to that of doing something else, such as staying at home. Evidence for the use of intuition to avoid accidents is given by William Cox, a mathematician who carried out a survey of passenger statistics on the US rail networks. Cox found that significantly fewer people traveled on trains involved in accidents than on comparable trains that were not involved in accidents. The survey doesn't tell us what caused the people to stay off the trains, but it seems reasonable to suppose that the passengers found themselves looking for something else to do on the day of the intended journey. A good example of the use of intuition is in the target guessing experiments, in which the participant has to guess which of a given set of options corresponds to the target randomly selected in the future. In a forced choice experiment, the participant intends for the selection of a given option to be associated with the idea of scoring a hit when she receives feedback of the target information in the future. In the case of an incorrect option, there will be no experience of that occurring, and an intuitive warning is produced. She unconsciously moves on to another option and tries again. When she comes to the correct option, so I've jumped one. When she comes to the correct option, there is no intuitive warning, and she registers the option. Her experience in the future is that in which the option is associated with scoring a hit when feedback is given. Notice that that she has to systematically eliminate each of the incorrect options until she is left with the correct one. She must have a genuine intention to register the option, so it is the intuitive warning that stops her from doing so in the case of an incorrect option. This avoids a causation loop in which resonance causes her to select the correct option, and the selection of the correct option leads to resonance. The free response and remote viewing experiments are explained in a similar way. For example, the participant has to describe features of a remote target location selected at random. he unconsciously activates items in his memory networks until a combination is found that corresponds to features of the target. The combination is associated with the idea of producing a successful result when feedback of the target information is given in the future. The resonance leads to a sustained activation of the present pathway, and the participant describes or sketches his impressions of the target. The participants in these experiments were usually taken to the target locations to receive feedback. But in military applications, to identify targets in enemy territory, feedback was rarely available, and the results were less successful. During the Stargate program, Ed May, who's with us now, noticed that the best targets were those associated with a sudden change in entropy. He suggested that the entropy may be an intrinsic target property responsible for success. But another interpretation is that the entropy changes, such as those associated with a train crash, are likely to be appraised by the participant as being highly significant for personal well-being, and therefore produce a strong emotional impact and a strong resonance. Okay, so now let's look at the use of intuition in everyday life. The first point to notice is that the participant always has to start with a definite intention to do something. The intention serves as a point of reference, and an intuitive warning is produced if the intention cannot be fulfilled. For example, people often seem to benefit from sleeping on decisions. If they have made a wrong decision, their intention will not be fulfilled, and they notice an intuitive warning corresponding to the absence of the intended future. They awaken feeling uneasy with the decision and change it. If they made the right decision, they can precognize knowledge of the fulfilling the intention, and they awaken feeling reassured about the decision made. Intuition can serve as an aid to solving problems. For example, a person uses intuition to select the most satisfactory option out of a number of alternatives. Notice, however, that some degree of distraction is often needed to allow the intuitive process to occur spontaneously. The ideas rarely come whilst one is concentrating on the problem. But if we go off and do something else, such as making a cup of coffee, we often find that the answer comes spontaneously and without any effort. The reason is that if we start thinking about a given option, it means that the brain is applying excessive stimulation to the networks corresponding to that option. The option is selected anyway without the help of intuition. So distraction is important, but it shouldn't be produced by an emotional event. Otherwise, that event will dominate attention, and we fail to notice the answer selected intuitively. Intuition is probably more effective over short time intervals, over which the effects of neuroplasticity are minimal. Rex Stanford proposed that organisms constantly scan the environment, looking for information related to the fulfillment of their needs. He called it psi-mediated instrumental response, and suggested that the scanning is done using ESP as well as the ordinary senses. This might explain the odd coincidences that turn out to have unexpected significance, such as finding oneself in the right place at the right time. Carl Jung referred to such coincidences as meaningful coincidences between the event and the person's prior knowledge of it. And Jim Carpenter has taken the idea a step further, giving priority to our psychic sense. He suggested that such a sense acts as a kind of psychic radar, which allows us to reach out a little beyond ourselves in space and ahead of ourselves in time. These examples should give an idea, an introduction to intuition. The mechanism can be applied, for example, to explain survival instinct, how the brain recognizes selected items from memory, and how intuitive thinking can be far more effective than analytical thinking. Further details are given in some of my papers, and especially in my book, Contact with the Future, to be published in September. To sum up, intuition is far more useful to us than ordinary precognition. Ordinary precognition tells us about our future destiny. There's nothing we can do to change it. But intuition can serve as an aid to our survival. It tells us about the intentions we cannot fulfill. And if this knowledge can save one's life on just a single occasion, then intuition is a faculty we should be very grateful to possess. Thank you.